In the spring of 2000, Whitney Houston walked off a music video set mid-shoot. She didn't say anything. She didn't make a scene. She just stopped, put the microphone down on the nearest surface, and walked toward the back of the studio. The crew froze. The director looked at his assistant director. The assistant director looked at the floor. And then George Michael got up and followed her. Not her manager, not her publicist, not the label rep who had been hovering near the catering table all morning with his phone pressed to his ear. George Michael, who had his own problems, his own wreckage, his own reasons to be somewhere far away from this city and this industry, got up and walked after her. If you've never heard this story before, stay with me, because what happened behind that set tells you everything about what it actually costs to be the greatest voice in the world. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss stories like this one. The song was called If I Told You That. It was a collaboration between two of the biggest names in music, released in 2000 as part of Whitney's My Love Is Your Love era. On paper, it was a celebration. Two icons, one track, a slick R&B production that the label knew would be a hit before anyone even finished mixing it. The music video was supposed to be simple, fun, a moment of pure joy for the fans who had watched both of them go through hell for the past few years. But here's the thing about joy when you're running on empty. It doesn't come on command. And by the time that shoot started, both of them were running on something much closer to survival. To understand what that morning really meant, you have to go back to 1998. George Michael's world collapsed in April of that year. The arrest in Beverly Hills, the headlines that followed, the mockery. It was vicious and it was relentless. In one afternoon, everything he had spent his career carefully building, the mystery, the image, the distance he kept between himself and the public eye, was gone. The world had a new version of him now, and they weren't interested in letting him tell his own story. He released a song called Outside almost immediately after, turned the whole thing into a defiant, funky, satirical anthem. Brilliant move, brave move. And inside that bravery, if you listen carefully, was a man who was absolutely exhausted from having to perform strength he didn't always feel. Whitney's story in those same years was different in its details, but identical in its weight. By 2000, the tabloids had decided who Whitney Houston was. They had a version of her they were selling, the tragedy, the downfall, the punchline. And they were committed to it with a kind of ferocity that had nothing to do with journalism and everything to do with spectacle. The woman who had stood in the Rose Bowl in 1991 and sung the national anthem in a way that made the whole country stop breathing. That woman was being slowly buried under headlines and rumors and the cruel arithmetic of public opinion. What made it worse was the expectation. Because Whitney wasn't allowed to be tired. She wasn't allowed to be struggling. She was Whitney Houston. She was supposed to walk into a room and fill it with light. That was the deal. That was the contract she had signed, not with Arista, but with the culture itself. And no one had ever asked her if the terms were fair. But here's what nobody ever talked about. The reason George Michael agreed to this collaboration, the reason he showed up that morning, wasn't just about the song. It was about a phone call. A 2 a.m. phone call that Whitney made sometime in late 1999 when she was sitting in a hotel room somewhere and had reached the particular kind of 2 a.m. that doesn't really have a name, but that most people have lived at least once. She called George, and he picked up. What they talked about that night isn't something either of them shared in interviews, but the fact that she called him and the fact that he answered, and the fact that they both showed up on that set months later, those are the data points that matter. The morning of the shoot, everything looked fine from the outside. The choreography was tight. The set was beautifully lit. There was energy in the room, that particular pre-shoot buzz when a crew is ready and the talent is in the building and everything is theoretically about to come together. But sets have a texture to them that cameras don't always capture. The crew could feel it. There was something underneath the professionalism, something heavy, something not quite right, that both George and Whitney were carrying into that room. They smiled at each other when they arrived. They were warm, gracious, completely composed. Whitney looked extraordinary. George looked like a man who had made a decision to be present, fully present, even when presence was costing him something. The first few takes went fine. The choreography worked. The chemistry on camera was real. It always is when two people who have genuinely been through something are standing next to each other. You can feel it. It doesn't look like performance. It looks like recognition. And then somewhere around the fourth or fifth take, Whitney stopped. She didn't collapse. She didn't have an outburst. She just stopped, put the microphone down, and walked to the back of the studio. The director called cut. There was a ripple of confused energy through the crew. And then George Michael stood up from the chair where he had been waiting and walked after her. And the ripple went quiet. Nobody followed them. That was the right call. What he said to her in that corner of the studio, away from every camera, every microphone, every person who was being paid to manage or protect or document one of them, is something only the two of them ever knew. But what happened when they came back says everything. They were back there maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20. It didn't feel long. It felt like the right amount of time for something true to be said and heard. When they walked back to the set, something had shifted. It's not something you could point to on a frame of footage. The choreography was the same. The song was the same. The lighting hadn't changed. But the director, who had been doing this for 20 years and had worked with some of the biggest names in the business, would later say that he almost didn't call action when they walked back in. Not because something was wrong, because what was in front of him in that moment felt like something you don't interrupt. Whitney stood at her mark. She looked at George, and then she looked somewhere else, somewhere inward, the way she sometimes did right before she sang, something that made people put their hands over their mouths. He nodded, just slightly, the kind of nod that means, I see you, not as a star, not as an icon, not as a brand or a legacy or a headline, just you. Whatever that is today, I see it. The cameras rolled, and something happened in those takes that you can feel even now, even in a 2-minute music video on a streaming platform. It's not about the vocals, although the vocals are extraordinary. It's in the way she moves through the song. There's a looseness to it, a real looseness. Not the performed looseness of a professional who knows how to look relaxed, but the actual looseness of someone who, for a few minutes, put down the weight they had been carrying and just existed inside the music. The song is a flirtatious R&B hit. The lyrics are light, almost playful. Two people circling each other, almost confessing something, pulling back at the last second. If I told you that I need you, is that something you could believe? Whitney wasn't singing it to George. She wasn't singing it to the camera or the director or the label executives who would review the footage later. She was singing it to herself, to the part of herself that had spent years being told what she was, what she owed, what she still needed to become. She was asking herself the question the song had been asking all along. And George Michael, standing a few feet away watching her do it, understood exactly what was happening, because he had asked himself the same question in different words, in darker rooms, for longer than either of them would ever say out loud. The video came out and the world saw what the world always sees: two beautiful electric performers doing what they do best. The record did well. The collaboration was celebrated. Fans loved it. Nobody knew about the 15 minutes at the back of the studio. Nobody knew about the 2 a.m. phone call. Nobody knew about the nod. And that's the part that stays with you if you let it. Because we talk about these people like they belong to us, like their talent was a gift they gave freely, with no cost attached, forever. Like the price of being that extraordinary is just, what? A given. Something they signed up for and were fine with? Whitney Houston spent the last decade of her life being watched by an entire culture that had already decided how her story ended. She was fighting something real and hard and private, and she was doing it in a spotlight that never turned off, surrounded by people who needed her to be Whitney Houston in a way that left almost no room for her to be anything else. George Michael died on Christmas Day in 2016, quietly, at home. The way people who have spent their whole career in the loudest rooms possible sometimes choose to go. When the news broke, there was a moment, just a moment, where people stopped and felt the specific weight of who he actually was. Not the headlines from 1998, not the tabloid version, the actual human being who had written Father Figure and One More Try and Careless Whisper, who had picked up the phone at 2 a.m. when someone needed him to, who had walked to the back of a studio on a spring morning in 2000, not because it was his job, but because it was the right thing to do. Whitney died in February 2012. She was 48 years old. She was found in a hotel room in Beverly Hills, the same city where 14 years earlier, George Michael's world had fallen apart and the press had treated it like entertainment. Both of them are gone now, and the music remains. Those extraordinary, irreplaceable voices that still come on the radio and make you pull over to the side of the road and just listen. But what also remains, if you know where to look, is that story from a spring morning in 2000, the one that didn't make the news, the one that happened in a corner of a studio while a crew of professionals pretended not to notice. George Michael saw something in Whitney that day that the entire industry, all the executives and critics and cameras, had missed. He saw a human being underneath the icon. Not the voice, not the brand, not the legacy. A person, tired and real and worth being seen. And for 15 minutes in the back of that studio, he made sure she knew it. Have you ever been in a room full of people and felt completely invisible until one person actually saw you? Not the version of you that everyone else had decided on, but the real thing? Tell us about it in the comments below, because that's what this story is really about. Not the music, not the fame. Just two people reminding each other that they were human. And sometimes that's the most important thing anyone can do.